I walked into that hospital room and almost didn't recognize my own brother. He was sitting by the window in one of those thin cotton gowns they give you when they want you to feel small. His hands were folded in his lap like a man who'd learned to make himself invisible. And his face. Lord, his face. The left side was still swollen. The bruise gone from purple to that sickly yellow-green that means it's been there a while. There was a small cut above his eyebrow that someone had closed with a butterfly strip, crooked, like whoever did it wasn't paying much attention. I stood in that doorway for a moment longer than I should have. Long enough that a nurse glanced at me from the hallway. I said his name. He looked up, and the thing that broke me, the thing I still carry, wasn't the bruising. It was how his eyes went flat for just a second before he recognized me. Like he'd trained himself not to react to footsteps. Like a man who'd learned that someone coming toward you wasn't always good news. His name was Arthur, my little brother. 61 years old and the best high school math teacher Sudbury ever produced, according to every retirement card his students ever wrote him. My brother, who could recite hockey statistics from the 1974 playoffs and who made the best butter tarts I have ever tasted in my life. That Arthur. Sitting in a psychiatric ward at St. Joseph's Health Center in Sudbury, Ontario, looking at me like he was waiting for permission to breathe. I crossed the room and sat down across from him and I said, "Arthur, what did they do to you?" He looked out the window for a long moment. Then he said, "It's not as bad as it looks." I had to close my eyes, because here's the thing about Arthur. He's always been the gentle one. Our mother used to say she got one son with a hard shell and one with a soft heart, and she was right about both of us. I spent 30 years working in industrial safety up in the nickel belt. I'm not a man who scares easily, and I'm not a man who loses his temper without reason. But I sat in that hospital room and looked at my brother's face and felt something I hadn't felt since I was 17 years old and a boy at school put his hands on Arthur at a bus stop. I felt the kind of calm that lives just on the other side of fury. Arthur's daughter, I'll call her my niece because that's who she is to me, blood and choice both. She'd been the one to call me 3 days earlier. She'd managed to slip out of the house while her husband was at work and her mother-in-law was napping, and she'd driven to a Tim Hortons 2 towns over and called me from a payphone because she was afraid her cell was being monitored. That's not paranoia, by the way. That's what living in that house had done to her. She told me her father had shown up at her door 2 weeks ago, trying to check on her, that her husband hadn't liked it, that words had been said, that her father-in-law and her husband's brother had gotten involved and things had escalated, and now Arthur was in the hospital and her husband was telling everyone that Arthur had had an episode and become violent and needed psychiatric evaluation. An episode. Arthur hadn't had any kind of episode in his life. The man grades papers with colored pens and cries at nature documentaries. I drove up from my place in Barrie that same night. 6 hours, stopped once for gas and a coffee outside of Parry Sound and kept going. By the time I got to Sudbury, it was past midnight, and I sat in a parking lot across from the hospital, and I called my niece back on the number she'd given me. She answered on the first ring. I could hear in 2 seconds that she'd been crying. Her name was Simone, 43 years old, one daughter of her own. 8 years old, sweet kid, called me Uncle Gerald the same way her mother did, even though I'm her great-uncle technically. Simone had been married to this man for 11 years. His name was Darren, and let me tell you, I will take my time with Darren. Darren was not a man who hit with his fists, at least not at first. That's the thing people don't understand about how this kind of thing works. It starts with smaller cruelties. What Simone wore, what she spent, who she talked to. He had opinions about everything and consequences for the wrong answers. Over 11 years, Simone had gone from a woman who ran a small bookkeeping business out of her home and played in a recreational curling league to a woman who asked permission to visit her own father and kept a prepaid phone hidden in the lining of a winter coat. And Darren's mother, Lorraine, she's another story entirely. Lorraine had moved in with them about 4 years ago after her husband passed, and what should have been a temporary arrangement had calcified into something permanent and impossible. Lorraine ran that house like a foreman. She had opinions about how Simone loaded the dishwasher and how she raised her daughter, and whether the curtains were open too much in the afternoon. She'd never once, in 11 years, called Simone by her actual name, just Darren's wife, as if that was identity enough. And then there was Darren's brother, Kyle. 29, lived in the basement, worked sporadically at a landscaping company when the weather suited him, and spent the rest of his time reinforcing every ugly thing Darren believed about himself and the people around him. 3 of them, all living in that house. And my niece in the middle of it like a bird that had forgotten it had wings. When Arthur had shown up wanting to check on his daughter, he had not been welcome. He'd been let in the door, barely, and within 20 minutes Darren had said something to him that I will not repeat here because some words don't deserve to be passed on. Arthur had stood his ground, the way a man does when someone insults his child in front of him. And then Kyle had come up from the basement, and then Lorraine had appeared from wherever she'd been, and by the time it was over, Arthur was on the driveway with his face rearranged, and a story had already been built to explain why. The story was that Arthur had threatened Darren, that he'd been unstable and aggressive, that they'd had to restrain him for everyone's sake. Darren had called 911 himself, had actually called 911, and stood there on that driveway composed and reasonable, and explained to the responding officers that his father-in-law had some mental health history and had arrived at the home in a disturbed state. Arthur had no mental health history, but he was 61, he was alone, he was shaken, and by the time the paramedics arrived, his blood pressure was through the roof and he was disoriented enough from the concussion that he wasn't making a lot of sense, and so they took him in. And Darren had looked like the concerned son-in-law who'd done the right thing. I sat in that parking lot in Sudbury, and I listened to my niece cry quietly on the other end of the line. And then I asked her one question. I said, "Simone, do you want out?" She didn't answer right away. That's the part people don't understand, and I'm going to say this plainly because I've read enough and listened enough to know it's true. Leaving isn't just a decision, it's a whole excavation. 11 years of being told your judgment is wrong doesn't just evaporate when someone offers you a door. Simone had her daughter to think about. She had a mortgage she wasn't sure she was on. She had a mother-in-law sleeping 30 feet from her bedroom and a husband who had made her feel, over 1,000 small moments, that she was not capable of surviving on her own. But after a long silence, she said yes. That was enough for me. I spent the next day at the hospital with Arthur, listening to everything. The whole 11 years of it. The parts Simone had shared with him, the things he'd noticed on his own when he was still allowed to visit. I took notes in a small notebook I'd bought at the gift shop downstairs. Then I drove to the Sudbury police station and I filed a report, not on behalf of Arthur only, though his injuries alone should have been enough, but with everything Simone had told him over the years, the pattern of it, documented as best we could. The officer I spoke to was kind, but she was honest with me too. She told me that cases like this were complicated, that without Simone herself coming forward, there was a limit to what they could pursue, that Arthur's injuries might be explained away by the account Darren had already given. She told me to make sure Arthur got a full medical report documenting his injuries, which we did. She told me to encourage Simone to speak with a victim services advocate, which I did, starting that same evening with a pamphlet slipped into the pocket of my niece's coat the one time I passed her in the hospital parking lot where she told me she'd be. That was day 2. By day 4, Arthur was well enough to be discharged, and he came to stay with a friend of his, a retired teacher named, well, I'll just call him Arthur's friend, who lived across town and had a spare room and a good deadbolt. and I stayed at a motel on the edge of Sudbury that had a coffee maker that worked and a parking lot where I could think. I thought for a long time, and then I had an idea. And I want to be careful about how I describe this, because what I am is a 64-year-old man from Barrie, Ontario, with a background in industrial safety and a brother who looks exactly like me. Arthur and I are twins, fraternal, not identical, but close enough that people have confused us our whole lives, especially when we were younger, and especially when you account for the fact that we both went gray in our 50s and we both carry ourselves the same way. That particular upright posture our father had, like a man who's been told he belongs somewhere and believed it. We are close enough, is what I'm saying, and Darren had never spent enough time around me to know the difference. I called Arthur at his friend's place on the 5th night. I explained what I was thinking. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Gerald, that's either the best idea you've had in 30 years or the worst one." I told him I was pretty sure it was one of those two. Here is what I did not do. I did not go over there to fight. I want to be very clear about that. I am 64 years old and I have some mileage on me, and I am not in the business of physical confrontation. What I did was this. I called Simone and I told her that I needed her to do something specific and that it would require some coordination and some trust. She listened. She agreed. And then I called a friend of mine, a woman I worked with for years up in the Nickel Belt, one of the sharpest people I know, now retired but still sharp as ever, and I asked her if she still had her digital audio recorder and whether she'd be willing to help an old colleague with something unusual. She said yes before I finished the sentence. The plan was simple. Simone was going to tell Darren that her father was coming by to apologize, to smooth things over, that Arthur had talked to someone, and he wanted to make things right for the sake of the family. Darren would like that. He'd like it very much, because it would confirm every story he'd been telling about Arthur, that Arthur had been in the wrong, that Arthur was unstable, that the family should be grateful to Darren for being the steady hand. Simone set it up for a Saturday afternoon. Kyle was going to be home, she told me, and Lorraine too. Good. I wanted witnesses. I drove to that house in a flannel shirt and the same kind of work boots Arthur always wears because the man has worn the same style of boots since 1987 and I happen to own the same pair. I kept my head down when I walked up the driveway. Darren opened the door. He looked at me for a second the way people do when they're checking whether they were right about something. Then he stepped back and let me in. The living room smelled like cigarette smoke and plug-in air freshener. Lorraine was in the armchair by the window with the television on, the sound low. Kyle was on the couch with his phone, didn't look up. Darren stood in the middle of the room with his arms crossed and this expression on his face. I know this expression. I've seen it on sites where a foreman has decided someone beneath him needs to be reminded of their position. Comfortable. Self-satisfied. He said, "So, you're here to apologize." Not a question. "Ush," I said, "I'm here to talk." He didn't like that wording. His eyes sharpened a little. He said, "No, I think you're here to apologize. For showing up here and making a scene and scaring my wife and daughter." My daughter was in tears, by the way. 8 years old, in tears because of you. I said, "Tell me what happened that day." He blinked. That wasn't what he'd expected. He said, "Excuse me?" I said, "Walk me through it. What happened?" He started talking. He couldn't help himself. That's the thing about people like Darren. They've told the story so many times it's polished now. They like performing it. He walked me through it in detail, how Arthur had arrived agitated, how he'd made threats, how they'd done what any family would do to protect themselves. He said the word aggressive 4 times. He said Arthur had grabbed him. I noted that because Arthur's hands barely work properly after a welding accident 30 years ago, and grabbing anything with force would have been physically difficult. He said Lorraine had been frightened. Lorraine in the armchair nodded on cue, and Kyle made a mistake. Kyle, without looking up from his phone, said, "Served him right, coming here acting like that." I said, "Kyle, did you touch my brother?" He did look up then, and his face did something complicated the way a face does when it's trying to decide between a lie and a boast and can't quite choose. He said, "I just helped Darren get him off." "Off of what?" I said. Silence. Darren's eyes moved to me. Something had shifted. Maybe it was the way I was standing. Maybe it was that I hadn't bent at all, not even slightly, since I'd walked in that door. He said slowly, "You don't seem much like you're here to apologize." I said, "That's because I'm not Arthur." The silence in that room was something I will remember for the rest of my life. Lorraine's head came up from the television. Kyle stood up from the couch. Darren's face went through about 4 different expressions in 2 seconds and settled on something ugly. He said, "What?" I introduced myself by name, by relationship, and then I told him calmly that a digital audio recording had been made of everything said in this room since I walked in the door. That a copy of that recording was already on its way to my lawyer and to the Victim Services Organization, that my niece had been in contact with all week. That Arthur's medical records from St. Joseph's had been formally documented, and that the attending physician had noted injuries consistent with blunt force trauma. That I had filed a report with Sudbury Police, and that Simone had, that same morning, provided her own statements to a victim services advocate, which she had then asked to be forwarded to the same officer. Darren looked at me for a long time. Then he looked at the hallway. Simone was standing in the hallway, not shaking, not crying, standing with her arms at her sides and her daughter beside her, the little girl's hand in hers, watching her father very steadily. Darren said, Simone said, "Don't." Just that one word. I'm going to tell you that the next several months were not simple, because they weren't. Nothing about this kind of situation is clean or quick. There were legal processes. There was a custody arrangement that had to be negotiated. There was a period where Simone and her daughter stayed with Arthur's friend across town, and then there was a period where they stayed with me and Barry while things were sorted out. Darren hired a lawyer. Darren's lawyer made some noise. Some of that noise was loud, and some of it was frightening, and all of it was meant to make Simone feel like this wasn't worth it. She held on. The recording was admissible in the civil proceedings because of Ontario's recording laws. One-party consent means that a person can record a conversation they are participating in. And my friend, who had been on the phone in my pocket the entire time, counted as a participant under the framing we'd established with the lawyer beforehand. Kyle's statement on that recording, his half-boast, his inability to fully deny what he'd done, became significant. Not enough for a criminal conviction on its own, but enough, combined with Arthur's medical records and Simone's statement, to matter in ways that Darren had not anticipated. The family court judge was not sympathetic to Darren. Lorraine moved out eventually. I'm told she went to live with a sister in Thunder Bay, which is a long way from Sudbury and further still from Barrie. Kyle, I have no information about, and I am comfortable with that. Darren. Well, Darren lost a great deal. The house had to be sold as part of the settlement, and Simone received her share, which was not nothing. He lost his position on the board of his homeowners association, which might sound minor, but which, for a man whose entire sense of self is about standing, was genuinely painful. He lost access to his daughter on anything but a supervised basis pending a review, which the review did not improve for him. He lost, most of all, the story. He'd been telling himself for 11 years that he was the responsible one, the stable one, the one holding everything together while everyone else fell apart. That story was over now, and whatever replaced it, he had to live with alone. Arthur healed. It took longer than it should have at our age. We don't bounce back the way we used to, I'll admit that freely, but he healed. He came to Barrie for a month that winter, and we watched a lot of hockey, and he made butter tarts, and I ate too many of them, and neither of us said anything about it. He went back to Sudbury in the spring and started volunteering at a tutoring center for kids who were struggling with math. He looked like himself again. He even laughed at something on the radio one morning, a real laugh, and I sat there at the kitchen table and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was still tight. Simone and her daughter have their own apartment now. It's small, smaller than what she was used to, and she'd be the first to tell you that, but it's hers. She got back her bookkeeping clients, most of them, and she's added some new ones. Her daughter is in 4th grade and plays on a minor hockey team and calls me on Sunday afternoons sometimes to tell me about the games. I am not a man who cries easily. I want to be clear about that, but I will admit that those Sunday phone calls hit me somewhere right in the middle. I've thought a lot about those 11 years, about what Simone lost and what she endured and what it cost her. I've thought about that top comment I've seen on videos like mine. The one that says, in real life, the victim defends the abuser, lies for him, keeps him out of trouble, and then takes more from him. I've thought about that because it's true and it's complicated, and it doesn't mean the victim is weak or foolish. It means they're human, and they've been in something so long that leaving feels more dangerous than staying. Simone isn't a cautionary tale. She's a person who survived something, and then she stopped surviving it and started living instead. Arthur called me last week. He said, "Gerald, you know what I keep thinking about?" I said, "What?" He said, "I keep thinking about the look on Darren's face when you told him you weren't me." I laughed. A real one. He said I would have paid money to see that. I told him the look had been worth the drive. He said, "Gerald, thank you." I told him he didn't need to say that. He said, "I know I don't need to, I wanted to." That's the difference between Arthur and me, really. He says the things that don't need to be said because he believes they should be said anyway. I've always been more likely to act and leave the words for later. But I'll tell you this. Sitting in that kitchen in Barrie with the hockey on low and Arthur across the table, from me looking like himself again, I understood, in a way I don't usually let myself feel things, that there is nothing in this world I would not do for that man. Nothing. And if you're listening to this and you know someone in a situation like Simone's, someone who's gone quiet, who's stopped showing up, who makes excuses for a person they shouldn't have to excuse, please don't wait for them to ask. Sometimes the kindest thing another person can do is simply refuse to look away. That's all I've got for today.